Today, I'm going to be sharing more of some of my work from the more phonetic side that I've been doing. And we can think about there is some of it that also links up with the some of the forensic side with some implications there. But yeah, so I'll be talking about co-articulation. So what I'm going to be primarily focused on today is the phenomenon that we call anticipatory nasal co-articulation. So this is when we speak, um, and we have nasal sounds like N's and M's in the words, and then and we have to lower the velum of the soft palate in the mouth in order for air to flow through the nose to make those sounds. This gesture doesn't happen just within the space of that consonant itself. And in order to prepare ourselves to make these nasal sounds, we often have to move the articulator, that is the velum, a bit earlier. So if we have vowels coming before the nasal consonants, then some part of the vowel will become nasalized, and this is what we refer to as anticipatory nasal co-articulation. So to give you an example, if we say the word Hong Kong, then we have got the nasals at the end of each syllable here. And what that means is that very often the vowels, the all vowel themselves, will have at least some part of it that carries some kind of nasalization. And that is what I'm going to be talking about today. And we're interested in nasal co-articulation for a few reasons. One, we know that this kind of co-articulation in speech is perceptually quite advantageous. So what that means is that in real time, listeners tend to pick up on some of the acoustic cues that anticipatory co-articulation brings. And so it's carried in the signal, and that helps with and that helps the listener to process what kind of and predict what kind of sounds might be coming up. So if I just say ba without the following consonant, you can get some of the clues from the vowel itself about whether the following consonant is likely an N, as in ban, or maybe an oral consonant like or as in bat. So that helps with the listeners. And that also links up with the next point, which is that we know that this kind of co-articulation acts as some kind of raw material for sound change. And this is something that I'm quite interested in exploring in this line of research. So, for example, in French and also in other languages like Portuguese, there are nasal vowels, so like as in bong, where the vowel itself is phonologically nasal, um, as sort of in contrast to oral vowels like bo. So the o versus ong contrast there, and the development of the nasal vowel historically comes from these sequences of sounds that's vowel followed by nasals. And so the vowel becomes nasalized, and at some point we lose the nasal consonant, and we're just left with the nasal vowels themselves. So looking into the sort of synchronic variation, so what variation we can see at a certain time across different languages, different dialects, as well as within those dialects and languages between different individuals, we're interested in seeing what kind of variation there is and what that might be able to tell us about sound change across time, and see if we can piece together some of the clues about how this sound change might have happened. In terms of so that kind of links into the mechanism of talking about this sound change. One of the most sort of prominent theories for this, how this happened, how co-articulation can give rise to this kind of sound change, comes from Ohala, who has a theory that this arises from the listeners passing error. So what this means is that when you, as a listener, hear the sequence that of a nasalized vowel followed by a nasal consonant, as in say like in the examples of like Hong Kong, as I was mentioning, you should be able to parse or understand that any nasalization that you hear on the vowel comes from the nasal consonant and is just a byproduct of that. And so the vowel itself is phonologically oral, not nasal. And so if you pass that correctly, then you will resolve in your head and say, okay, there is an oral vowel, there is a nasal consonant. But if you have a passing error, then what that means is that you would actually think that the vowel itself should be nasal, and that becomes the mechanism for the sound change, for the nasal vowel to arise. And this kind of passing error is also used to explain different kinds of sound change as well. So not just nasal vowels, but also things like how U's, say in German, historically develops into U, the fronting of the vowel in environments because of co-articulation from front vowels like E. Another sort of more recent view is taken by Bador that doesn't attribute the sound change as coming from some kind of error that the listener made, but instead talks about this in terms of individual specific phonological grammar. So in the sense that we know that the extent of the coarticulatory effect, so that is how much the vowel is nasalized, co-varies in some sense. So there is a correlation with some kind of variation in the coarticulatory source itself. So how much there is co-articulation is also reflected in the nasal consonant too. And so individuals with even within the language, they will have differences in the weights that they attach to the cue that they can hear from the source, that is the consonant, versus the cue that they can hear from the effect, that is the vowel itself. And so if we have a situation where the listener's own phonological interpretation, because of their own individual grammar, differs from the speaker's one, because there is a mismatch that way, then that gives rise to the possibility of sound change, because then what the speaker may well intend uh, as co-articulatory nasalization is in the listener's interpretation what they think of uh, as becoming the nasalization as part of the vowel rather than purely as co-articulation. So this is a difference in terms of what the listeners attend to rather than saying there is some kind of error. And so in terms of the how this might work, so Badal as a theory would say that if we're thinking about how this develops into nasal vowels, then we have a what we call kind of a leftward alignment of the velum gesture. What that simply means is that the velum lowering that we need for the nasal vowel, the nasal consonant starts earlier, shifts towards the left. And so what you end up with is the velum lowering gesture shifting more into the vowel. And so in that case we have longer co-articulation, longer nasalization, and a shorter nasal consonant. So it's kind of like a time shift effect. And so when that happens, then that also gives rise to an increasing perceptual reliance on the nasalized portion of the vowel. So because the nasalized portion of the vowel becomes longer, listeners attend to it more and use it more to say, ah, this is actually, this is the word ban now because I can hear the nasalized vowel rather than saying, oh, I can hear the consonant N itself. So relying more on the on the nasalized portion of the vowel, and that facilitates as sort of that pathway towards the sound change. Another sort of perspective on what might give evidence to uh, this nasalization being phonologized and then becoming uh, going on that path towards sound change of the nasal vowels comes from Soleil quite a little bit earlier, who looked at two different languages in contrast in to compare. So on the left-hand side, we have Spanish, which we know that co-articulation is purely sort of mechanical, like I was describing earlier, where you simply have co-articulation and some part of the vowel being nasalized because you need to start that gesture earlier. And so in that case, kind of dependent, no matter what duration of the vowel you have, how much of the vowel is nasalized is really just dependent on the consonant itself and not really on the vowel. And so in that case, what we would expect is for Spanish, in languages like Spanish, you would observe a what we call a constant time nasalization. So without, regardless of how long the vowel is, you end up with just about the same amount of it that is being nasalized. And that's in contrast to American English, where uh, it's been said that the nasalization is becoming phonologized. So this instead of having constant time nasalization, then part of the vowel is being targeted as nasal. So speakers think of the vowel as having some kind of nasal target when it comes before a nasal consonant, and so instead of producing constant time nasalization, uh, they produce constant sort of a constant proportion of the vowel becomes nasalized. And so by looking at the relationship of how much the vowel is nasalized uh, in co-articulation in comparison to how long the vowels are and how long the nasal consonants are, we can get a sense of how at what stage potentially of this sound change that language or that specific variety might be. And we see also in languages like Spanish, some other researchers have conducted some kind of like cross-dialectal comparisons, looking at two different dialects to see if one dialect may be on more in a more advanced stage of this kind of sound change than others. Um, I did promise I'm going to be looking starting from the within the individual. So part of that sort of story, we were talking about how this might differ across languages or across dialects. And when I was talking about Bador's theory, there is also the sort of that sub-level where how do we get to a point where there is cross-language variation in this kind of co-articulation? And so uh, that rests on between speaker variation. And so there is also the question then, so what gives rise to that between speaker variation? And we don't have a lot of theories right now as to how that happens, but one perspective would be to also look into the within speaker variability and think about whether that acts as also as a mechanism to give rise to between speaker variability, so we can push sort of some kind of sound change mechanism from within the speaker to between speakers and then upwards, sort of, and that propagates even further, even wider. So one perspective on this would be what we call the H&H theory from Lindblom. So this is hyperspeech and hypospeech, or in uh, or we can think of, so like hyperspeech is where you have to be sort of hyper articulating and where you have to be particularly clear in terms of what you're saying. Versus hypospeech is when you're already saying something that people already know a lot about. People already can expect very well what you're going to say, and so you can do a lot of speech reduction without having to clearly articulate, and people still understand you perfectly well what you're talking about. And so when we're talking about this kind of spectrum between hyperspeech and hypospeech, this gives rise to a whole spectrum of possibility of within speaker variability of what they can produce as particular speech sounds, even for the same sort of phonemes of for the same categories. Um, and so this comes from adaptation to both sort of speaker-oriented and listener-oriented goals. So how much we want to make it intelligible and clear to the listener, as well as balancing that with how much effort we want to expend, because hyper-articulating, speaking very clearly, is more sort of articulatory, more effortful, and there is a principle of economy where if we can, we want to reduce the effort, so use the minimum amount of effort to help the listener to get to where we can achieve mutual understanding. So the idea is primarily that co-articulation should be reduced in hyperspeech when we clearly articulate, um, because because co-articulation uh, introduces extra variability into the acoustic signal, and so by reducing the co-articulation, by reducing the how much influence, say, the following N has on your vowel, you can emphasize on the acoustic quality of that vowel itself. And so that helps the listener potentially to understand that this is the vowel that you're talking about, without having to think about all the additional variabilities that the surrounding context might have on the vowel itself. And so when a listener happens to attend to that particular cue and accept that particular variant of phonetic production, then that might give help to give rise to that kind of sound change. So that leads me on to the studies that I'm going to be talking about. So I'm going to be thinking about sort of linking levels of variation with kind of the broader story of sound change on three levels here. So across languages, I'm going to be looking at American English, German, and French. Metropolitan French being French that's spoken in France versus in northern France, the sort of standard variety around Paris, versus say southern France, the regional variety, or in Canada. And I'm going to be thinking about this from a cross-dialectal perspective, focusing particularly on Southern British English. And finally, I'm going to be looking at Lombard speech, and I'll turn to what that is in a second, to think about within speaker variation. So, for the cross-language comparisons, this is work that's been done in during my time as a postdoc. And this was on the project Speakers, Languages, and Listeners, that has an international team with members from UCL, from University of Munich, and across Austria as well. So it was a kind of international collaboration between the UK, Germany, and Austria. And you can see the full sort of results of the paper, of what I'm going to be talking about, is published in this Journal of Phonetics paper 2 years, sort of about 2 years ago. So you can see more details there if you want to. So in this project, we were quite deliberately looking into a large number of speakers across different sort of domains and phenomena and co-articulatory phenomena. So we're looking at three different languages, and we looked at both production and perception, and we also looked at both nasal co-articulation and labial co-articulation, so being like rounding co-articulation. But I'm going to be focusing on just the production today, as well as just talking about nasals. So in this particular project, we're comparing these three languages because they have differences in whether in the presence of a nasal oral contrast. So I was talking about nasal vowels in French before, and this is something that's in this set is only unique to French. German doesn't have nasal phonologically nasal vowels. American English also doesn't, but in the literature, it's been suggested that it's kind of in a weird way, and we'll come back to that in a bit. But I did mention before that it's been suggested that in American English, uh, the vowel nasalization or the co-articulation of nasals has been phonologized, so it's kind of has this in-between status. Um, so we're particularly interested in comparing these languages in order to think about whether phonological contrast in nasal and oral vowels, whether that would condition the temporal domain of anticipatory nasal co-articulation. So within this, we're particularly interested in thinking, so we do have nasal co-articulation. We know that some languages have use a lot of co-articulation, so a lot of the vowel can be nasalized under co-articulation, and some languages, strangely, do really only do quite little of it. And we want to understand what kind of factors and whether it is the phonological contrast that governs this kind of the how extensive that nasal co-articulation is across languages. So this is the main question that we're working with. So we work within this sort of minimal pair framework where we compared the sort of maximal possible window of co-articulation in each of these languages. So basically what we did is designed uh, a phrase that has so you can see the say the second phrase for English, he'll tell Cleo rhymer soon, or he'll tell Cleo riper soon. So this only differs in that one consonant near the end, which is the M versus the P. So this is nasal versus oral consonant, and we have this window of sounds that's coming before it. That allows for the co-articulation from the nasal consonant to spread in anticipation. So we might find the part of the I vowel being nasalized, or it could be even further, or maybe part of the R in rhymer could also be nasalized, or it could go even further. So the vowels in Cleo are also nasalized. We don't really know before this study, like how long it is across these languages that nasalization could spread this co-articulation. So we're interested in seeing, let's compare across these languages, how far does co-articulation go and how much does phonological contrast have a role to play? Our prediction really is that French in the bottom here should have very little co-articulation because the idea is that if you have co-articulation on the vowel, then the oral vowel becomes more nasalized. And because French has nasalized vowels, if you have a nasalized vowel competing with a nasal vowel, then it creates more confusion for the listeners. And so you would want to probably avoid that by using not so much co-articulation. So then keeping the distinction between oral vowels that's nasalized versus nasal vowels, keeping that contrast distinct as possible. So we predicted that French would have minimal co-articulation. German doesn't have this contrast, so they don't have to be so afraid of this lexical confusion, and so there would be more co-articulation. English is the weird one, where because it is suggested that there is some kind of phonologization, we predict that actually, and also people have looked into long distance nasal co-articulation in English before and found that it has been quite extensive. So following the previous literature, we were kind of expecting that there is going to be quite extensive co-articulation for English. So We measured nasality using a technique called nasometry, and this is what we're going to be using in the next couple of studies as well. So what this does is you have two microphones, one and then one plate in between. And so one microphone basically records what's coming out from the nose, and the other records what's coming out from the mouth. And you have the plate in between to sort of separate the signals. And so what you get is this signal on top that's coming out from the nose, and the signal from the bottom that's the from coming out from the mouth. So this is in German, so there's something clear Laune. So you have the nasal consonant here, and so you can see corresponding to that, the nasal channel has a lot of sound energy, which is what we expected to see because this is the nasal consonant, and really nothing much coming out from the mouth. But what you can also see is that this nasal energy starts quite a bit earlier, somewhere in the ow vowel. And so we're interested in looking at this kind of time point here, seeing, okay, at what point do we really start to see this picking up of the sound energy from the nasal coarticulation? So this is what we're looking at really. So we're comparing when we have the nasal consonants versus when we have the sort of oral consonants coming after. Where do we see that sort of points of divergence in the vowel or even before? So, in terms of, so we're coming straight to the results here. So what we have is this kind of picture of cross-linguistic variation. So if I orientate you towards the graph on the right, what we see, so we have zero on the right-hand side. So zero is where the consonant starts. So the more negative here, the more co-articulation there is, essentially. And we're measuring things in real time. So what you can see is that French, which is a blue curve here, has the shortest nasalization. So you can see the peak being very close to zero, whereas German has a little bit longer, but English really does take the crown as having the longest stretch of co-articulation. And you can see English, the red curve has a very long and heavy tail as well towards the more negative numbers. So there are lots of instances where speakers have very extensive co-articulation that we can so the nasalization starts very early on. And so that's what we see, English earlier than German and French. The difference between German and French doesn't come out as statistically significant, but English is longer. If we're really thinking about it in terms of units, so how much of the vowel is nasalized, then we can also look at this from a slightly different angle. This is the same data, but we're plotting it in terms of how long, like what is the proportion of the vowel. So from 0 to -1 would be the duration of the vowel itself. So if we got to -2, then that's twice as long as the vowel is. And what we see is that, so first of all, in both English and in both French and German, it's the peaks are primarily within the vowel itself, but it's very close to -1, meaning that actually most of the vowel in both languages are nasalized. Whereas for English, the peak, there is a very long peak is behind the vowel, and there is a very long tail here. So English really does seem to have this nasalization that stretches very far back. And we can see from the percentages from here as well that for the most part, English has this nasalization stretching beyond 100% of the duration of the vowel. So in terms of, so if we come back to the question, does a phonological contrast constrain co-articulation? English and German, we expected it to be more co-articulatory than French. So well, what we found is that French is constrained relative to English, but German really kind of isn't patterning the same way as we expected. German patterns more with French and not with English. So that kind of makes us wonder, well, is it the case that because French has the nasal vowel and oral vowel contrast, the presence of that contrast has a constraining effect, but then the absence of it doesn't really. Um, But that also doesn't really sort of chime with the results, being that actually co-articulation is just very long in the first place. So because almost all of the vowels are on average co-articulated and nasalized, in many cases it extends beyond the vowel. So that kind of defeats that theory a little bit. And what we're thinking actually is that there are speakers actually do use alternative cues, for example, different tongue positions, to preserve the nasal and oral vowel contrast instead of just relying on nasality itself. But we'll come back to American English and the sort of extra weirdness about it. What we're thinking about American English is that it potentially uh, corroborates the sort of earlier theories that we have in phonologized nasal target, so that it becomes so that the vowel itself acts as the source of articulation. If you have the vowel uh, specified as having a nasal target, then uh, in a similar way to the nasal consonant, it can act as a source of co-articulation. And that is how and that we think is how co-articulation spreads even further back in the case of American English. So if we hold that thought, we'll come back to American English in the end to think about its role. But I'll turn to British English now to look at this kind of cross-dialectal perspective. Um, I was interested in British English because, well, we did it in the earlier study that most studies actually focus on American English when we look at nasalization and nasal co-articulation. And very often we have this assumption in the literature that British English doesn't really do anticipatory nasal co-articulation. We assume that it's much in a much earlier stage than American English is, but there isn't really empirical evidence until these 1 or 2 years when people are starting to look into it. And we have all these conflicting descriptions in the literature, sort of qualitatively speaking, about whether some dialects or some accents of British English may have really strong nasalization or actually have really, really weak nasal co-articulation. So we don't really know we haven't really known what's going on. Although anecdotally, we know that there is quite a bit of sociolinguistic variation across different classes, across different regions, and across different accents. So part of me doing this work is trying to add a little bit of evidence to say, okay, we think that British English doesn't really do nasal co-articulation. Do we actually have evidence for it? So I was interested in looking at how nasalized nasal vowels, sort of these vowels are in these vowel nasal sequences, and comparing this with Bador's and Soleil's theories that I was talking about earlier to see whether there is any evidence of phonologization in British English, with a full expectation that we shouldn't be able to find evidence of phonologization. It's a mouthful. So this is work done in a project funded by the Forensic Phonetics and Acoustics Association, and there is a broader aim here looking at vocal effort and nasal co-articulation. So we'll come back to this in the third study. But this is work that I am doing in collaboration with colleagues at UCL, Chris Carrickman. So what we're doing in this, so we have some data collected from a specific reading task. So basically, we asked speakers to read out some words in a kind of semi-spontaneous format. I can answer questions about this. And so we collected data in these kinds of contexts where the vowel is surrounded by oral consonants, oral and nasal consonants, and nasal consonants to compare the kind of nasality and nasalization that we have in these different contexts. And so we're primarily interested in what happens in what we call the CVN context, what happens when the vowel comes before the nasal consonant. And we're measuring, similarly, we're using nasometry to do the measurements, and we're measuring co-articulation in this kind of in two different ways. We're thinking about this both in terms of magnitude, how much of the vowel is is nasalized, as well as temporal measures. So, like how far back does that nasalization go? So it's jumping straight into the results that I'm currently have. So this is the magnitude measure. So how much of the vowel is nasalized. So we're looking at vowel dividing the results by vowels here, and with according to vowel height as well. So on the left hand side, we have the vowels, high vowels like fleece and goose, so like e and u, and then the low vowels are on the right hand side. So like ah vowels like bath and trap. These ones are on the right hand side. And what we see is this kind of like very gradient relationship according to vowel height. So more open vowels, so like bath and strut, tend to be slightly more nasalized than close vowels like fleece and goose. And this is actually something that we expect to come out as purely from a sort of phonetic perspective. We expect open vowels because the velum is also linked to the jaw and the muscles are linked. We expect that when you open, there's more jaw opening. We expect there to be more velum opening as a sort of byproduct, phonetic byproduct of that. So this is actually expected. Um, but we also find, interestingly, that across that picture of very gradient and just generally low level nasal coarticulation, we have these two vowels, bath and trap, that have substantially higher uh, degrees of nasalization. So these two vowels may be doing something slightly weird compared to the rest of them. Um, And also, if we look at temporal measures as well, so lower on the graph here is the onset of the nasal consonant. So this would be if we this would be very little coarticulation versus high up on the graph is more coarticulation because it's closer to the onset of the vowel. Then we see a very similar picture to what we did from the magnitude measures. Again, we have low degrees of nasalization, particularly in the close, more high vowels. And we have this sort of more or less gradients effect. But again, we see that the two vowels stand out as doing something slightly different, as having particularly high degrees of nasalization in British English, well, Southern British English anyway. So we have Bath and Trap again being the standouts. So uh, in terms of if we're comparing the relationship between, I'm just going to show everything here. If we're comparing the relationship between vowel nasalization duration and the vowel duration and nasal consonant duration, we don't particularly see kind of any sort of the sort of proportional effects that we might expect to see if we have phonologized nasalization. But we do have some evidence that Bath and Trap, if especially on the left-hand side, that they seem to be doing something different in that when vowel duration increases, we see particular increase in the duration of the vowel that is being nasalized. So that kind of fits into this like Slay's sense of story that there seems to be a more sort of proportional uh, a proportion of the vowel that's being nasalized and targeted as nasal rather than sort of a more constant time of the vowel becoming nasalized as a result of mechanistic coarticulation. So we seem to start to see some kind of divide between trap and like the two R vowels compared to the other vowels here. So to kind of briefly sum up that particular study, in terms of thinking about Southern British English and where we are with co-articulation, uh, there isn't evidence yet of phonologized vowel nasality for most vowels. It's, co-articulation is relatively low. We see relatively constant timed nasalization, and we don't see that kind of trading relation that Bador has been talking about. But Bath and Trap seem to be starting to be developing some distinctive patterns. And so if we're going to say that any of the vowels are on the trajectory towards sound change, then it may be that these two vowels are starting to do something like that. Finally, I'm going to be talking a bit about Lombard speech in terms of within speaker variation. And this work has been published last year in Speech Communication. So you can see more details there as well. So remember I mentioned at the beginning that coarticulation is expected to be reduced in hyperspeech. So Lombard speech is where you're speaking primarily, say, in noise. And so you raise your voice and in order to make yourself more intelligible. So if you have but what we found is so there is the expectation that coarticulation is expected to be reduced in hyperspeech, including say Lombard speech. But we have seen quite mixed findings looking at different kinds of coarticulatory phenomena in the literature. So in some cases we do see reduction, in other cases we see sort of a general maintenance of use of coarticulation. Lombard speech in particular isn't specifically investigated a lot, but in that case we have found some reduction. There are a couple of studies that have specifically looked at the relationship between clear speech and nasal coarticulation. So not other types of coarticulatory phenomena, but just nasal coarticulation that we're looking at today. And what seems to be particularly interesting is that in these cases, instead of looking at reduced coarticulation, um, all they have found is that there is more coarticulation. Speakers make the vowels before nasal consonants more nasal using more coarticulation than in clear speech than in quiet speech. So this was particularly intriguing. But one thing, so to coming back to these, is sort of coming back to the point about American English being potentially weird, is that all these studies are done in American English, where we know that there is potentially some other factors going on that might make that might mean that it's not necessarily just nasal coarticulation that we're seeing. So I'm going to be looking at nasal coarticulation between quiet speech and Lombard speech in British English. So in that particular project that I'm introduced in the last study, um, we also recorded data in two Lombard speech sort of environments where we played the speaker a lot of white noise in their ears and have them do the task at the same time. So we're comparing these conditions when they have to, because they have noise in their ears, they're likely to speak in Lombard speech and speaking louder and using whether more or less coarticulation is what we want to see compared to quiet speech when they don't have noise in their ears. And so if we're looking at if we're looking at nasality first, we're comparing the use of nasality across these different contexts. And so what we're particularly interested in is that upward curve. That's the co-articulatory context, CVN. So what we find is that quiet in the quiet context condition, speakers are being more nasal than in Lombard speech. So when you speak in Lombard speech, your vowels become more oral, less nasal for British English speakers. Nasality decreases more in when there are when it's not in this kind of CVC context, so when it's not in that oral baseline. And we find also that in terms of trajectory, the green and the red curves rise less sharply than the blue ones, meaning that nasality rises quite a bit less in those conditions. So in terms of then thinking about coarticulation, so that was just nasality, but we're thinking about coarticulation in particular and thinking about how much of the space of coarticulation that speakers are using. We don't actually find all that much difference between these different contexts, focusing particularly on the left one here between in sort of the anticipatory nasal coarticulation. There isn't really any difference in terms of how much of the sort of space of nasalization that speakers can be using, that they actually did use. It's quite consistent between quiet condition and Lombard conditions. Bonus slide of individual variability that I don't really have time to get into, but I'm happy to answer questions about that. So if we're coming back finally to intra-speaker variability, so the take-home message here is that speakers do lower vowel nasality, so it becomes oral, more oral in Lombard speech, but they mostly maintain coarticulation in Lombard speech. And how do we reconcile these two things that seem to be going on here? Um, so so what this means for us is that corticulatory nasality does decrease, but it is decreasing in correspondence to a range of nasalization that is available when everything becomes more oral and less nasalized. Then you have less space essentially to make things sound nasal. And so speakers adjust themselves to that. And so they use coarticulation in pretty much the same way, but just different levels of nasality. So it may suggest that maintaining coarticulation and enhancing that distinctiveness are not separate goals, but joint compatible goals of clear speech production that speakers are sort of navigating around. So to wrap up, so trying to pull all these together, what does that mean for studies of coarticulation and sound change? To me, I think coarticulation is a really important part of thinking about this sound change. There is no denying that in what we see. But especially if we're focusing on the English language here, most of these studies focus on American English historically. We have had decades of research on American English, and we're still doing that. But all the evidence seems to suggest that American English is likely already well on the way towards some kind of phonologized nasal coarticulation. And we saw that from the cross-linguistic comparisons we did. And in comparing some of the results that I have on British English versus American English, we can see that British English speakers and American English speakers are doing very different things. For example, in clear speech slash Lombard speech, British English speakers lower vowel nasality. They don't use greater nasality as American English speakers do. And we see generally there is a very different level of coarticulation for American and British English speakers. So in telling this story of sound change and how coarticulation gives rise to this sound change, American and British Englishes seem to be like two different sides of the coin, telling two different sides of the story. American English is at the stage of the sound change where you can tell what is happening when you're going through phonologization, whereas British English is starting to tell us that story about what speakers do and what happens when you haven't gone through that stage. So we seem to be maybe in that case, we need to be looking more into British English as well as other varieties of English and in fact other languages to find where we are in between these things and see if we can have uh, find sort of more dialects and languages on different parts, stages of this particular sound change that allows us to piece together more of that story of how this sound change, what the mechanisms are that happen, and across these different levels. So, like I say, my concluding thoughts here are that this co-articulation is very important in helping us link synchronic variability and diachronic change. And a lot of the work that I've been doing focuses on the production aspect, but we also know that in order for sound change to complete, it doesn't just happen in production, but it also happens in perception. And the link between production and perception, where it happens first and where the sound change really takes place, is because of some kind of perceptual error, or is because of sort of variation in production that gives rise to this. We need to look into this quite a bit more in order to understand where sort of how we go from that individual speaker actuating a particular sound change, and then that propagating more widely into the population and giving rise to variation that we see across languages. So that's everything I have. Thank you very much for having me today.